In the Old West, men ran because they believed distance could save them. They crossed rivers. They vanished into forests. They hid among nations and borders where sheriffs feared to ride. And for a time, it worked. Until Heck Thomas. Heck Thomas believed fugitives belonged behind bars, or in graves if they resisted. Not because he was cruel. Not because he was angry. But because, to him, the law was not a suggestion. It was a debt. And debts always came due. A land without reach. By the late 1800s, Indian Territory had become a refuge for America's worst criminals. It was a place without clear jurisdiction, where federal authority thinned out and local enforcement rarely survived long enough to matter. Outlaws knew this. They fled there in droves, bank robbers, killers, train thieves, gunmen whose names filled wanted posters across the country. They believed the territory swallowed men whole. They believed no one could follow. They were wrong. The making of a manhunter. Henry Andrew Heck Thomas was born in 1850, shaped not by myth but by discipline. He grew up in a country still healing from civil war, where order had to be rebuilt one arrest at a time. Thomas didn't swagger. He didn't boast. He didn't wear flash or seek fame. What he carried instead was patience, and a memory that never let go. When he joined the ranks of federal law enforcement, Thomas quickly distinguished himself not by how fast he drew, but by how carefully he planned. He studied men. He learned patterns. He learned when criminals felt safe, and when they made mistakes. That skill would soon earn him a place among the deadliest trio in frontier history. The Three Guardsmen. Judge Isaac Parker, the infamous hanging judge of Fort Smith, Arkansas, presided over a court that covered Indian Territory. Parker sentenced hundreds to prison, and many to the gallows. But sentences meant nothing if fugitives couldn't be caught. To enforce his rulings, Parker relied on three men: Heck Thomas, Bill Tillman, and Chris Madsen. They became known as the Three Guardsmen. They didn't ride together often, but when they did, fugitives vanished from the territory for good. Among them, Heck Thomas was the shadow. The tracker. The man who never stopped. Hunting without hurry. Heck Thomas never rushed a hunt. He gathered information slowly, listening to whispers in saloons, watching horse tracks fade into nothing, memorizing faces seen only once. He didn't announce himself. He didn't threaten towns into cooperation. He waited. And then, when the moment came, he moved with precision. Thomas understood something many gunfighters never learned: speed attracts mistakes. Patience starves them. Gunfights and survival. Thomas survived dozens of gunfights, not because he was reckless, but because he avoided them until there was no alternative. When bullets came, he didn't panic. He moved with intent. Witnesses said he fired only when necessary, and rarely missed. He was shot more than once. He was ambushed. He was hunted himself. And still, he kept riding. Fugitives learned to recognize the signs. A quiet stranger asking careful questions. A rider who didn't brag. A man who watched exits before ordering a drink. When Heck Thomas was nearby, people felt it. Outlaws learned the truth. Criminals talked. And when they did, one name surfaced again and again, not shouted, but muttered. Thomas. Outlaws didn't hate him. They respected him. And they feared him more for it. Because Heck Thomas didn't negotiate. He didn't threaten. He didn't make speeches. He simply arrived. And when he did, running no longer mattered. The capture of legends. Thomas played a critical role in dismantling outlaw networks across Indian Territory. Bringing in men others couldn't touch. He helped break gangs that relied on safe houses, informants, and tribal borders for protection. Thomas learned those systems, and then used them against the criminals who trusted them. He remembered faces. He remembered names. And years later, he'd recognize a man who thought time had erased his crimes. It hadn't. A reputation that traveled first. Often, Heck Thomas didn't need to fire a shot. His reputation arrived ahead of him. Men surrendered when they realized who stood before them. Others tried to run, and failed. There was no pleasure in it for Thomas. Only completion. Justice wasn't dramatic to him. It was methodical. The end of the wild refuge. As Thomas and the guardsmen continued their work, Indian Territory changed. Outlaws stopped seeing it as safe. Criminal networks collapsed. The idea that the territory was unreachable died slowly, but decisively. It wasn't tamed by one man. But Heck Thomas made sure it could no longer hide anyone. The man behind the badge. Off the trail, Thomas was reserved. Quiet. Professional. He didn't mythologize himself. He didn't write dime novels or court reporters. His satisfaction came from knowing a warrant was served, a sentence fulfilled, a family no longer terrorized by a name whispered in fear. For Thomas, justice didn't end when the gunfire stopped. It ended when order returned. The passing of an era. As the frontier closed, men like Heck Thomas became relics of a brutal necessity. Railroads spread. Courts expanded. Law no longer had to ride armed into wilderness. Thomas lived to see the West change, and he accepted it without bitterness. The job was done. Legacy. Heck Thomas died in 1935, long after the age that created him had passed. He left behind no legend crafted by showmen. No exaggerated tales. No romanticized myths. What he left instead was quieter, and heavier. Proof that in a lawless land, justice didn't need to be loud. It only needed to be relentless. To fugitives, Heck Thomas wasn't a man. He was the sound of hooves in the distance. The knock that came eventually. The law that did not forget. He was inevitability.